This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. During the age of social distancing, we're recording remotely and releasing extra episodes. Today's guest is Roger Manning Jr., keyboardist and founding member of bands such as Beatnik Beach, Jellyfish, Imperial Drag, and the Moog Cookbook. Roger and I met last summer when he was on tour playing keyboards with Beck. His latest band, the Lickerish Quartet, will release its first EP, Threesome Volume 1, on Friday. Roger spoke to me from his home in Los Angeles.
Oh,
Roger.
hey Joe.
Hey man, how are you?
I'm doing good, as well as can be expected. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. When you say as well as can be expected, is your life significantly different now that we're under quarantine? Like as far as your schedule or your day-to-day?
No, thankfully.
So what have you been up to today?
Well, I'm trying to do a better job at social media, primarily because I'm part of a trio. It's a group called the Lickerish Quartet, and it's made up of myself and two former band members from the Jellyfish days.
But it's called the Lickerish Quartet.
Correct. And we, by sheer coincidence, with no intention of things timing out this way, we released our first of 3 EPs after the public had not heard anything from the three of us for almost 25 years. On March 13th, basically the weekend that America realized, oh crap, we're in the thick of this, and here we go. It became real for a lot of people. Every time I do some kind of, fan experience campaign, because we're not signed to a major. I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but obviously in the 30 years I've been in the record business, things continue to evolve. And social media is so much a part of it. And while a lot of people have been enjoying social media since its inception, I don't derive any fulfillment from it. Well, that's not entirely true. Let's just say time is limited, and I don't feel the need to devote any time to it.
So then why bother?
Because ultimately for me, it becomes a big thank you. By some miracle, fans who were part of Jellyfish World and the bands that were immediately following that, like Imperial Drag that I was involved in, they've been sticking with us no matter how many dry spells there have been, which really blows my mind. At my manager's encouragement in 2018, when I released a 4-song solo EP, which was the first recordings I'd had out in 10 years of purely original music of myself, he was begging me to have some kind of presence on Instagram and Facebook and so forth. And I was just overwhelmed by the gratitude. And so did my best to make sure all those people felt appreciated. That's what the whole thing was about. It was just like we're just constantly feeding each other. And it was basically, they're just sitting there going, look, we have a few dollars in our pocket. We have loads of enthusiasm. If you've got more music to make, please give it to us. We're starving. We're dying of thirst, and that's a swift kick in the butt to really dig down and do what I ultimately love to do more than anything else. So, social media has become my way of just trying to make people feel appreciated. I mean, obviously, getting flooded with compliments, my ego loves that, but that's not. I believe in myself ultimately, and while the compliments always feel good, that's not. I didn't enter this business to feel better about myself. I think that's a personal responsibility that one needs to take. So anyway, that's the long-winded answer to your question.
So are you able to make social media into a creatively satisfying proposition for yourself so it doesn't feel like a waste of time?
Not really. There are obviously the more time you want to spend on it, that's great. People get super creative, and people absolutely find it another outlet for their creative expression. If I'm going to put together some kind of song video or edit together some kind of clip, either by myself or with my collaborators, there's a whole creative, time-intensive process there, and ultimately, I have to weigh it like any other project. It's like, all right, what's the time investment, and what's the return, and what am I doing today that's taking me away or distracting me from my true passion, which is writing and realizing original music. Now, I wear many, many hats, not only for creative fulfillment, but to keep a roof over my head. And I'm a freelance, juggler. And there's nothing more gratifying in the 30 years I've been doing this than, like I said, writing and realizing my own music. So if some presence on social media facilitates more of that for a longer duration, I'd be a fool not to play that and try to derive as much pleasure out of it as possible. But I'm in awe of well, you and I probably know many, many artists in quotations who are influencer, social media exchange masters, and that's actually their career. The fact that they refer themselves as a songwriter, a musician, or that's more tertiary. It's not even secondary. A lot of them are, it's the old oh, I'm an actor and a singer and a social media influencer and a model. It's like, all right, more power to you. When I roll out of bed in the morning, there's only one drug I want a fix of, above and beyond everything else that gives me pleasure in my life. And that's continuing to realize, what creative dreams I have.
I thought you were going to say, and that's heroin.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you said that you didn't get into the business to feel better about yourself. So what did you get into the business to do?
I didn't get into the business to derive my sense of self-image from the outside world. I believe whether one's doing music or what have you, sports, it doesn't matter. It's all about relationship with self. So in any given moment, you're basically, if one's walking with any kind of awareness, you're checking in with how you're feeling and how are you doing, and how are you going to be with what is going on all around you in any given moment. Fortunately, during high school, college, which for a lot of people as they grow into young adulthood can be a terribly challenging period in all respects, and for me it was no different. And in committing to being the best I could at my instrument and then naturally segueing into songwriting, I found out very, very fast that the more I applied myself, the more this literally invisible vibrational mystery could give me tons of pleasure, literally physically in my body, but more importantly in my emotional body. And I was in charge of that IV drip. I was in charge of that fix. I was in charge of the dosage. And when I first set out to write songs, I had a standard for myself, like I did with everything I ventured into, whether that was skateboarding or trying to be a good keyboard player or drummer or what have you. And when I got into songwriting, I was like, oh my God, this is one of the most challenging things ever. I know what I would like it to be like, and I'm just terrible at it. And it was years and years of trying to write song ideas that gave me no gratification. And cracking the code, why did my heroes make me feel the way they did? And how do I create something original? And I learned early on, at the risk of stating the obvious, if I wasn't getting off on it, if I wasn't enjoying it at a deep, deep level, it wasn't blowing my mind and making my heart feel a certain way, then there was no point in attempting to share it. So that was the first litmus test. And then if I passed that test, I'd be like, Hey, girlfriend, what do you think of this? Hey, record critic, what do you think of this? Hey, best friend, and then you set it out in the world, and lo and behold, there's no surprise. There were, people who were like, oh, thanks, but no thanks. And then this whole mystery audience was like, oh my God, where have you been all my life kind of thing. And Jellyfish certainly had almost like this mini Grateful Dead kind of rabid following. And it was looking like it was going to get bigger before we disbanded. But so I hope I answered your question in there.
Well, let's go back before that. Where did you grow up?
I was born in L.A. We were supposed to just live in L.A. suburbs like Valencia our whole life because that's where my folks were from. And then my dad got transferred up to San Francisco Bay Area. So he worked in Oakland, and he found this perfect new little burgeoning suburb for us called Pleasanton. And it was population 30,000 and had one main street, and it was a Hells Angels watering hole in the 70s, and it was just the most idyllic place to raise three boys. And so that's where I grew up, and then college brought me back down to Los Angeles.
What was your dad doing that brought him up to the Bay Area?
He was a calculator salesman, and then when he realized that computers were around the corner and nobody's going to want a calculator, he jumped ship and taught himself real estate, and has been in primarily residential real estate ever since.
And what about your mom?
She was always a school teacher, and she loves it, and she took breaks every time she had a new child, and then always went back, and then she just retired about 10 years ago or so. She's been so it was a two-income household, and they were juggling that.
And you said there were three boys. Where did you fall in the birth order?
I was first.
Ah, okay. Were your parents particularly musical people?
No. For better or for worse. I'm actually astonished at how few records we had in the house, including one Beatles record. There was Simon and Garfunkel, Creed. All the records were killer. Oh, I mean, I'm partial to 60s pop, but
I like to call it boomer standards.
Yes, exactly. Which I might as well be called a boomer at that point because I'm so partial to a lot of those standards. But my mom sang in choir, but no, it was not a musical family. My dad's brother is a drummer, and in the 60s, as a young man, he played in quite a few kind of Sunset Strip bands. Was definitely like on the scene. He played with Davey Allen and the Arrows, and he knew all the guys in Love, and my favorite band from LA, the Music Machine at the time. He drifted in and out of that into the 70s. And, really hasn't been music has not been his profession for years, but that was really the only connection. But it was him who, I was in awe that he was a drummer, and so all I wanted to do was be a drummer. My mom and dad were like, well, he seems to have some kind of affinity for this. We should give him lessons if we can afford them. But he's going to need to learn chords. Like, he can't just learn rhythm. Like, my mom was smart enough to make that connection. So it was either going to be guitar or piano. And my grandparents had just donated a secondhand piano to us for free. So my mom was like, you're taking piano lessons. and seriously, I didn't care at all. I just did it because it was easy. All I wanted to do was play the drums.
And then how did that come to be? How did you start playing drums?
From pots and pans and boxes, the old story. A friend of mine for Christmas, for Christmas I got a toy drum set. We destroyed that in about 3 weeks. And then around 6th grade, my uncle that I told you about sold me his 5-piece Ludwig Abalone Ringo copy drum set, which had seen better days, but it was fine. And I bought some cymbals with some paper route money and took off from there. And I kept taking piano lessons and then taught myself drums.
That's interesting because I had a similar trajectory wherein I started playing piano when I was 6, and then I was allowed to start playing drums at 11. I didn't really connect with piano. Like you said, for me it was pretty intuitive. I never got great at it, but drums were somehow like a vehicle into the world, and I had a larger emotional response to them right away. I wonder if you had a similar experience.
Yeah, drums were emotional from the get-go, and the interesting part about piano, I almost quit twice, and then the first event was, depending on what age your listeners are. If you remember the Paul Newman, Robert Redford movie, The Sting, that had an all ragtime piano soundtrack by
It had
Marvin
the
Hamlish.
entertainer, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was 74. Yeah. And I was just about to quit, telling my parents, this is not for me. I don't understand the point of any of this. I'm not interested. I'm playing all this classical literature and I'm reading, and I don't like any of the classical literature. But it's Mozart. Don't like him. And so the entertainer comes along, and I'm like, good God, what the hell is this? That's piano, but I've never heard anything like it. And what I was hearing was jazz harmony for the first time, or in a real way. And it went against everything I was being taught at my traditional classical piano lessons. So then, piano teacher, she found the sheet music. So suddenly I was off and running with ragtime, which was quite challenging. It really stopped me dead in my tracks. But first of all, I didn't have the hand size. Most people don't, to reach all of the voicings. So then I did that for a little while, then lost interest again. And somewhere around 7th grade, when I started having money to buy my own records and stuff, I fell in love with the band Chicago, who had, top 10 hits for years. But they were from the jazz rock tradition of the 60s, and their music was, like Steely Dan, in that it had a lot of jazz harmony and stuff in the writing. And I fell in love with them and the variety of styles they explored. And then I found that you could buy the sheet music at a record store that was a chain. It was called Music Land. And anybody who grew up in the 70s would go to a mall. There was always a Music Land. And they'd front load the store with vinyl and cassettes. But way, way, way in the back was sheet music to literally the top 40. So I learned these songs I was hearing on the radio, and it was blowing my mind. I was like, wait, it doesn't sound like the radio when I'm playing it, but that's definitely the harmony. That's definitely what, the chords that they're doing. And that really whet my appetite. That was like this mystery had just been solved, this eternal riddle of the rock stars in the heavens that were, essentially deities. They were just superpowers. They were literally superheroes for my generation, whether it was Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin or Cheap Trick, you name it, and Sex Pistols, Ramones, whatever. So now I'm actually going, oh, that's what a chord is. I taught myself chords because that's not what piano lessons were teaching me. I get to high school, the two junior highs merge, and these very talented musicians from the other junior high came over. A couple keyboard players, lots of drummers, a bass player, some saxophone players, and they were blowing my mind. They knew how to jam. They knew how to play chords, play rock. They could do a little bit of jazz, Police songs. It was just, oh my God, how are you people doing this? And suddenly I was like, I kind of forgot about drums, because here were all these drummers who were light years better than me. And I was fascinated by keyboards because I was becoming aware of synthesizers, drum machines. That was right at the turn of the 70s into the 80s. Samplers, all this technology is happening, and I'm having my mind blown. And I'm also being introduced by these older kids to music beyond the top 40 and the standard classic rock fare that I had been raised with in the suburbs.
And then did you start a band?
No, we all kind of agreed. We basically session musicians, jazzers, the individual members of progressive rock bands. It was the music makers themselves that became our heroes. So we were very clear that you had better develop some kind of proficiency on your instrument. Like it didn't even occur. It's like, how dare we start a band? We can't even play yet, which I know is very opposite of how a lot of garage bands start. In fact, a lot of great musicians and heroes of mine started that way. But we were like, no, man, you got to get your chops together. You got to go, you got to go do what Miles Davis said and Herbie Hancock said, and just go shred 8 hours a day if you really want to have the freedom to do what you hear these people doing. So fortunately for me and the guys, we just made this great kind of nerd collective. We were the band geeks. There were other pejoratives that were called, but I'll just go with that. And as girls became less interested, I just buried my frustration and pain and just dove 1,000 miles an hour into music. There were plenty of drugs that could have taken me off my path, but music just was always more fascinating and interesting to me. So thankfully I had a healthy release to drown my sorrows in. But, we'd save $20 during the week, get the bus to Berkeley, which is about 45 minutes from where we lived, and we just shopped dollar vinyl. This was in 81, 82, 83. And we'd show each other what we bought after we'd we'd come home with 60 records. 3 guys go to Berkeley, we'd come home with 60 records. And then we'd tape each other's records. So it was just like this musical candy store orgy from hell. It was like one guy's going, look, here's a record that I found that Herbie Hancock plays keyboards on. Oh, well, who's this drummer? Oh, his name is Simon Phillips. Well, who's Steve Gadd? Oh, look, he plays on these records. And just on and on and on. And it wasn't just jazz fusion stuff. It was progressive rock and ambient Tangerine Dream psych stuff, like experimental new wave art, like post-punk art stuff that's coming out of England. It was just such an exciting time because you had bands like the Talking Heads, Peter Gabriel, Blondie, Gang of Four, Susie and the Banshees, all these bands who were literally in the top 20, having careers, making money, and they couldn't have been more art school. And all of them were different from each other, but they had one thing in common, and they knew how to write a frickin' hook. And it's because they were all children of the 60s. So they grew up with classic, amazing songwriting, and no matter how experimental they got with what they wanted to say to the world, they never lost good songwriting architecture. And this is what we were, drinking at 1,000 miles an hour.
What were your ambitions at the time?
My ambitions were to become, eventually in high school, was to become the best jazz pianist I could. But I loved working with drum machines. A buddy of mine, 2 of my friends were able to buy drum machines. One of my friends bought a synthesizer. We had electric pianos. I liked all of it. Junior, senior year, we did finally form a band. I had a full-on punk band that I played drums in, a little skate rat. That's the other thing I did. We had a ska band with horns and everything. We had a jazz quartet, sax and a rhythm section trio. So it was just full speed ahead trying to develop my abilities in all those areas. And it never, ever occurred to me to sing or try to write lyrics. That's what other people did. I was a player. That all changed in college, though.
Did you want to be like the guys who you were discovering in liner notes? Did you picture yourself becoming a professional musician?
Yes. Well, that was, you asked what was the dream at that point. That was, if there was one, it was that. It was a lot of my heroes, whether it was Thomas Dolby or Lyle Mays from Pat Metheny's group or Chick and Herbie or any of the guys Zappa was using, all these people were, it was kind of understood you were jazz competent, but that also allowed you to go off into any territories. Like if you had your jazz foundation together, you could play bebop the rest of your life if you wanted to, or you could go into hip hop or punk or pop or Madonna. You could be an arranger. The guys who did all Madonna's first stuff we were in love with because they were jazz funk guys from the 70s. All the people who were playing with Michael Jackson, all those cats were very, very entrenched in jazz tradition, and we understood that. That's what we were trying to master. But then we'd still have our band that sounded like Missing Persons and the Police after school, and that's what we got the greatest fulfillment, was that variety. So that it was never boring. It was not like you burnt out on something because there was always something else to hook your attention.
You mentioned that you came to LA for college. Where'd you go?
Much to everybody's surprise, including my own, I went to USC. I got accepted to a lot of music schools around the country, some very prestigious ones, including some scholarships. And at the end of the day, I decided I did not want to be on the East Coast. I didn't get the East Coast. It was like Europe to me. It was too foreign and weird. I hated the weather. I knew I was going to be locked in a practice room the whole time, but it was just too much of a leap in being, leaving small town boy territory. I had family in Los Angeles, so I had some roots. I knew how to navigate Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, every time I would visit every summer, it reminded me that everything was going on there. I was very immersed in, like I said, the kind of skate punk world, and then when the hardcore scene started evolving, I enjoyed all those things, and all that experimentation was taking place in LA. LA also had jazzers, it also had film scoring world, it had session players, it had everything going on musically, classical certainly. So I was like, you know what? I don't know what I want to do yet with music. Let's go drop in the center of Los Angeles and see what happens. It literally was practicing jazz by day and going to weird clubs at night and seeing bands like Jane's Addiction and Fishbone and Chili Peppers in their infancy. And a lot of stuff coming out of punk at the time was very, I don't want to say theatrical, but the stage show was definitely a part of it. It's like, I always used to joke, I never owned a Red Hot Chili Peppers album, but I wouldn't miss a performance back then, because they were just like, they just were endlessly energetic and entertaining, and took command and demanded your attention and just really gave you entertainment on their terms. And that fascinated me. Being a little bookworm piano study guy, I had a extrovert side that loved the theatrical part of stuff. I had taken some improv classes in high school and stuff, and I enjoyed them. So there was this kind of extrovert part of me as well that, the jazz worlds and stuff didn't offer, but a lot of the post-punk world did. And I was fascinated by that at the time.
You mentioned that it was around this time that you started to think about writing songs. How come?
One of my best mates in high school, very talented drummer. We all were in this kind of music geek collective that I was telling you about. He was a year older than me. He graduated early from high school. And I moved down to L.A. He stayed up in Northern California and was drumming and involved in a variety of acts, and we loosely stayed in touch, and we'd swap cassettes, mixtapes for each other and everything. And he shared with me some material. He goes, here's some stuff I've been writing. I'm like, oh, that's weird. Okay, send it to me. I was listening to it, and I get back to him, I go, man, this is incredible. You've programmed all the drum machines and synthesizers, and you use your dad's 4-track reel-to-reel. It sounds amazing, and I really like kind of the new progressive kind of new wave thing you got going. It was very modern. I go, who's singing? He goes, that's me. I go, no, it's not. You're a drummer. Who's singing? He goes, that's me. And I was floored. His voice was as good as anything. And I was like, holy shit. And it swiftly kicked me in the ass. And I was like, I'm not going to be the next Chick or Herbie. That's not really where my heart is. And I was really enjoying a lot of bands in Los Angeles who were writing original music. So between my friend inspiring me and local talent inspiring me, I was like, I've got to try this. And it was miserable. At the time, my favorite band, and still one of my favorite to this day, is the band XTC. And I probably relate more to Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding's compositions than any artist I can think of, even though there's many. And so I just started learning XTC songs for the first time, even though I'd been listening to them for years. Why is that chord going to that chord, and why does it make my stomach feel weird? I better figure this out. And that's what I set out to do. I was completely hooked and obsessed.
Is that something that still comes into play when you're writing now? Do you parse through things intellectually, or do you try to work in a more instinctive manner?
Oh, I would insist nobody do anything but have it be an instinctive manner. So for me, songwriting, I can't speak for other people, has been like learning any skill set. You copy the masters, and you copy them deep, and then you throw them away. And hopefully at that point you've developed a tool belt and a resource library that you can just cherry pick anytime you want. And what happens is it starts becoming second nature, right? This is like anything.
Yeah, or something that a lot of other people have kind of discussed is trying to copy the masters and failing into something original.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's I guess that's, well, there have been certain times when I've certainly sat down and went, I want to write a song that has a feel like this, or has this energy, or I want to write a waltz.
Right.
Today my songwriting goal is to write something in 3/4. there's stuff like that, and I'll put little limitations on myself or a focus, or sometimes I'll just sit down and just something comes out. I've written a lot of my favorite songs while not in front of an instrument, while walking to my car in the
Mm-hmm.
parking lot or walking home from class, and the rhythm of walking will generate these feels. And if I'm in a good mood, I've almost never written a song while sad. I've only written while happy and optimistic and hopeful and feeling good about myself and life. I know a lot of amazing music comes out of tragedy. That's never been the case for me.
That's
I've certainly
interesting.
written sorrowful songs. I've written gut-wrenching songs, tear-jerking, emotionally evocative songs, but they weren't ever born out of tragedy. Now, I'm not saying I didn't have sorrow stored away in my heart somewhere that came out later, but I always sat down in a generally positive mood, or even maybe melancholy.
So when you were at USC, you were studying music?
Yeah, I was a jazz studies major, so I entered school as a performance major. I was going to be a little jazzer, and thankfully took lots and lots of theory and comp classes while I was there. I should have, hindsight's 2020. I would have liked to have changed my major to composition and gone even deeper, because that would have been another skill set like reading that is just indisposable. As it's turned out, any composition that I've applied in my life, I've learned on the job mostly, and again from my jazz training, which is great. I mean, I can transcribe anything I hear, which is a huge asset, because if I don't know what's going on, I can transcribe it and go, "Oh, this is what the composer was doing." So, music school was invaluable, and it allowed me the time to figure out exactly what I wanted to say in music and why. But I don't insist that people go to music school. I mean, again, some of my best influences and inspirations and heroes are completely untrained.
Did you stick around to graduate?
Barely. But yes, I did. I felt, my God, my parents were kind enough to put so much investment into me here. It'd be stupid to leave after my junior year. And the only reason I almost left was because I teamed up again with my old partner, which I told you about, Andy Sturmer, who initially inspired me to write all those years prior. He had a project in the Bay Area where he was writing and singing with another gentleman who was writing and singing, and they had gotten the interest of Atlantic Records. Their keyboard player left shortly before they were signed, and I got the invitation, and I accepted, and I spent my senior year in Los Angeles driving up every 2 weeks to rehearse and play shows with them in San Francisco.
And that band became Jellyfish.
Right, because that band was Beatnik Beach, which then imploded after about 2 years, and Andy and I birthed Jellyfish out of those ashes, yes.
What does Jellyfish represent to you now? Like, if you hear one of the songs that you wrote during that period, how does it make you feel?
Thankfully, it makes me feel, well, it takes me back to that time in my life as a young man, but it's kind of timeless in that, that was our goal, was to write classic pop with our personal twist on it. And that's what it still is to me. I have no regret. I see the, inner child in me bouncing around in those songs, just being free and as unedited as possible. It's my essence and my collaborators' essence at that time in our lives.
When you signed to Atlantic and were making records and going on the road, did it feel like you had arrived?
No, not at all. It was very humbling. Well, I'll tell you how much it didn't feel like we'd arrived. We had been signed for upwards of 6 months. We were about to release a record, and a bunch of the heads of Atlantic came to the Bay Area to just do business, but they were also there to see us play a show. We were opening for Chris Isaacs, who was another Bay Area sensation at the time. And after the show, we were introduced to all the gentlemen from the record company, and basically everybody but Ahmet Erdogan was there. And we're shaking all these execs' hands who'd been at the company for years. They were the old guard. One guy leans down to me and shouts in my face amongst the din of the music. He says, "I tell you what you do. You get your manager to talk to our lawyers, talk to our people. I think we might have a record deal for you down the road." the guy was so oblivious and so in the upper echelons of the corporate establishment, he had no idea that his company had already signed us for the last 6 months and was about to take a huge financial risk on a record that was about to come out. And that, in one fell swoop, I was introduced to the corporate major label world. And it reminded me how volatile and fleeting the whole thing was. And that's why anytime there was an accomplishment, my partner and I were just like, okay, whatever. We're super thankful for this, but it could all explode in our faces tomorrow. Because that's what happened to friends of ours. We had friends who had gotten signed, record A&R guy gets fired, and they're dropped. Okay. They were rock stars in their mind for 9 months, and then it's all over.
Yeah, it's so interesting because so much of what you're describing is, it's beyond the actual creation of music, and then relying on this kind of corporate behemoth to distribute your work, and kind of like balancing the desire for certain external mile markers with your own kind of internal joy and wanting to keep going and sustain it, despite what happens that's beyond your control. It's a difficult world to navigate.
It's not for everybody, and it's the hardest job you'll ever love, kind of thing. Yeah, for sure. And I don't regret any of it. I've been trying my damnedest since day one. I've had huge returns. I couldn't be more grateful for. I mean, the trajectory never goes like you think it's going to go. There's never been many forks in the road, and I chose to take the left path instead of the right path, and hindsight's 20/20 and all that. But man, it's just been adventure after adventure, and I've collaborated with some incredible talents along the way.
So Jellyfish, in its initial run, released 2 albums, and you broke up after not being a band for all that long in the grand scheme of things. What happened?
Yeah, well, we'd actually been a band for about 6 years, but you're right. As far as the public was concerned, it was 2 records and 2 tours over a 3-year time span. But it was basically musical differences between my partner and I, and just wanting to take a break from each other personally, having been, basically married to each other for 6 years. And it was that simple.
Did it feel like a divorce when you broke up the band? Like, how central to your identity was being a member of that band? And did it take some serious soul searching to kind of reconcile who you were as a person absent the band?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I found out right away just how much of my identity I'd made the band when it was no longer there. But yeah, it was absolutely a divorce in the sense that these songs were our children. And I think both of us, including lots of other band members, were all considering departing at different times. And you didn't because you wanted to see your children have the best lives that they could, meaning you wanted to see the songs be given the old college try. Well, if we break up now, the song's not going to be able to go to MTV and get on, a video rotation. It still has a chance to be a hit. Let's not break up now. Oh, the song could have a life at radio. Let's not break up now. Oh, that next tour we get opening for that act could be the golden ticket. Let's not break up now. So, I mean, we never, in the life of the band, other than some publishing advance money, thankfully, like a lot of bands' stories, we never made a dime on the project. Because back in those days, you had to sell through to gold before you then kind of entered the profit margin. So even though our first album sold 275,000 copies worldwide, which would be a high five for Taylor Swift today, that was considered an absolute economic failure. Yeah, you guys got some radio play. Yeah, you guys were on MTV. You had a few good opening slots on the road, but we lost money, and so it's understood that you're losers. And had we gone gold, and you hit that mark, where basically gold means you're breaking even. You're now paying back all your debts to the record company, which means you're in the profit margin. So any sales that come in after that, et cetera, you get to pocket to some degree. That never happened for us. So it's not like money was keeping us together. We both could probably cite many, many bands who should have broken up years ago, but they're like, hell no, this is my meal ticket. And we'll take separate limousines to the show and separate private jets to the next town because we can't stand to be in each other's company. And we lost respect for each other as collaborators and people years ago, but the paychecks are just too damn fat. And I have mortgages on 4 homes.
What was the impetus to start the Moog Cookbook?
Escapism. Brian Kehoe and I, who you may know, we met each other in 1994 due to our obsession with vintage keyboard equipment. He was selling a Optagon keyboard in the recycler, pre-eBay trade, pre-Craigslist trade paper in LA.
And for people that don't know, an Optagon was an optical keyboard toy. I think it was made by Hasbro or Mattel back in the 70s.
That's correct. Yes. And it read celluloid.
Celluloid discs.
It had a light sensor.
Yeah.
So it was like a Mellotron, but it didn't have actual tape flying through the heads. And we found that we were a similar age. We had similar inspirations musically. We were obsessed with what some of these antiques could do. And lo and behold, in the early 90s, people were just getting into computers, were obsessed with samplers and digital synthesis, and nobody could care about Hammond organs, Mellotrons, Wurlitzers, clavinets, and analog synths. The only people who cared about analog synths were the early techno-industrial pioneers, the early club kids, and unfortunately they were jacking the modular prices up. So never were able to afford any modulars back then, but we bought everything else that we could get our hands on. And we were sitting on this mass collection of gear, that amusing ourselves to death at the height of grunge, guitar bands only. And we would offer musicians we know, hey, have us come in and decorate your music with some of these amazing sounds. And they'd be like, why would I want to do that? It's not a guitar. So we formed Moog Cookbook as an escape to literally have an excuse to really delve deep into a lot of these instruments, some of which we knew how to program and get under the hoods of very well. Others were colossal mysteries. We'd never owned them. What does this do? What happens when you put this button and cross-modulate these pieces here? Blah, blah, blah. And that's what that was about. And then we also were mad thrift store people. I mean, we just lived out of secondhand flea markets and thrift store world and had amassed huge quantities of vinyl. I never stopped buying dollar vinyl since high school. And we loved collecting the old synthesizer records from the 60s and 70s. Moog plays the hits of the Beatles. It all started with
Wendy Carlos.
Yeah, the switched on classical albums. Well, that ran its course very quickly, and suddenly people are covering Bacharach and all the light hits of radio. And these records were so educational and so funny to us. And we were like, well, what if we did a similar thing, but for contemporary times? And so we just took K-Rock's playlist that week, which was things like Lenny Kravitz and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Neil Young and what have you, and we said, let's just start tackling these. Let's have fun arranging with our toys. And that's what we did. We were with a couple of ADATs in Brian's, one ADAT in Brian's bedroom, and just went to town with no real goal. We would just do something, and if it amused us, we'd leave it. And the whole point was to really have fun arranging. Again, this is without a computer, so you couldn't cut and splice. It was traditional recording, even though it had ADATs, but to make each other laugh. So as I was starting to get more and more frustrated with my rock and roll projects, this became a release for me. The rock pop things I was doing post Jellyfish were signed and moving forward in that machine. And Moog Cookbook provided the no rules, no parents telling me what to do. This is where I get to continue to express my rebellious side. And it was really, there's a lot, those albums are really appreciated because there's so many inside jokes musically, because we just didn't, there was a freedom. We weren't as invested. I don't want to say we didn't care. It's just that I wasn't as invested as I was in my major label projects.
Right, which actually can sometimes lead to better results because you're less precious about it.
Absolutely.
less neurotic.
So that was another valuable lesson I learned. You're 100% right.
You and I have lots of mutual friends, but we only met this past summer because I was up in upstate New York working on an album, and you were playing nearby with Beck, who you've played with for many years now. How do you navigate the ratio of sideman gigs versus, your own projects? How do you kind of determine how much time you're spending facilitating someone else's vision versus, putting your own vision forth into the world?
Doing the juggling act between music that I like more than anything else, which is my original music, and sideman work, it's just like, it's a juggling act. It's just common sense financially. I'm thankful I've been able to do it all. So every gig, I'm 100% freelance. I derive compensation from every bit of work that I do, a little bit here, a lot there, some there. It's just all over the map, and I'm thankful for that. But ultimately, that's the deciding factor. I did some solo albums back to back in the 2000s, which were signed in Japan. There were three actually. There was two as my kind of pop rock self, and then a third one that came out in 2007 under my DJ moniker Malibu. And I'm not a DJ, but Beck had jokingly given me that name, and I thought it worked. And it was basically my kind of take on the whole, techno, early EDM, pop, instrumental, Kraftwerk, whatever you want to call it. And I had a blast doing that album. All three of those records had a life in Japan, and what I mean by that was I got on the radio, I sold some units, I went over there to play some shows at clubs, I played Fuji Rock twice, freaking miracle. The record company hustled me like nobody's business. The whole machine, the way the machine is supposed to work, it worked. Japan showed me that when everybody's on board and all the keys lock, you can have your cake and eat it too. Well, so I paid all my expenses back to those record companies, made a little bit in the process, and after 4 years really throwing myself into that, the rest of the world didn't see me. I was off the road from Beck at the time. The freelance world didn't see much of me because I was immersed, there's very much an out of sight, out of mind in this business, as you're probably all too aware. And also, like, if my name came up, it'd kind of be like, well, we don't want to bother him. He's working on his stuff back home. Whatever. We'll call this guy. Okay. Haven't seen Roger for a while. Huh? Okay, whatever. And 2008 rolled around, and I was taking a meeting with my accountant and realizing that as much fun as I'd had for 4 years, I wasn't doing too well. That's not good for a freelance musician. You can't lose your nest egg. Basically, like, if I can't figure out a way to make this solo stuff sustainable, then I can't keep doing it. And I'm going to continue to take other jobs that have a price tag associated with them. And that's what I did. So that was in 2008. So the last 10 years have been about shuffling and, mixing and managing, and what does freelance life look like? How can I keep doing all of it and still get my bills paid and all that stuff? It's the same question everybody has to ask themselves. And I don't even have children. I don't know how people do. They're raising a family and they're freelance and they're doing original music. It's like, good luck, buddy. And some of them are doing it and they're doing just great. That's fantastic.
Some of them that I've talked to said it gives them an increased sense of focus because now they have other people that they're responsible for. So it makes them work even harder. Absolutely. And I don't know how I could have worked any harder. Yeah.
than I have in the last 30 years. with no regrets. I mean, I love what I do. You don't have to get me to work on music. It's you're like working into the night with bags under your eyes. You're underslept. You're undernourished. You're like, got it. I solved the riddle. That sounds good.
Earlier, you mentioned that music is the only drug that you have a fix for. If we're going to use the drug analogy, have you ever gone through a phase where your tolerance is so high that you're not really getting joy from it?
One of the things that has happened, it's the part of aging I don't like, and that's being jaded. I do feel like a man at a time. I feel like I'm an expert in a field that doesn't care about experts. And all these cliches that I'm saying, I'm sure everybody goes through as they evolve through a life in music. I'm sure it happens to everyone, but I can only speak from personal experiences, as trite as it might sound. And as genres come and go, it's very, I might, as a architect of music, I might go, oh, well, this new song that was just honored at the Grammys or whatever, yeah, I certainly can appreciate the programming that went into it. Whoever was in charge of this really did some neat stuff with the stereo field and some super intricate rhythmic drum programming or whatever. And then I go, yep, but it doesn't touch my heart at all. There's no emotional conveyance. They might as well be speaking French. I don't understand what they're saying at all. It's not speaking to my musical ears on the other end of that receiving end. Meanwhile, the whole rest of the world is going, saviors, we've been waiting for you. You've healed the world with your music. You've changed. I've never felt so deeply. Well, great. I'm not feeling that at all. Because right at the end of the day, it's always subjective.
Yeah,
so
and it's an interesting question to me. Like you said, if they might as well be speaking in French, then is it incumbent upon the listener to learn French?
No, that'd be like me telling my mom she has to learn jazz.
I know. Well, lots of jazz musicians will say something like, "Oh, you have to come to the music. The music doesn't just come to you. You have to meet it halfway."
I absolutely agree with that. I to this day derive great pleasure from jazz literature, both playing it and listening to it. I do not know how the rest of the world. The jazz audience is incredibly small. It was only ever big in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, and then it started to wane. I mean, really, it was never what it was in its heyday. But you had, there's a lot to be said for that, because you had people being born in the 30s and 40s, 20s, who were born into hearing Gershwin. Okay, they're hearing super deep, intricate chromaticism. Well, if you're raised with that, then when a Sonny Rollins album comes out in the late 50s or a Coltrane record comes out in the 60s, you're not that far away. They're basically extending on a tradition. What sounds weird to you is when four chord skiffle rock via Buddy Holly, via the Beatles, is blasting through your teenage daughter's radio, and you've been listening to Ellington all your life. Then you're in for a real surprise, because you don't have the training to appreciate Buddy Holly or the Everly Brothers.
Mm-hmm. But beyond the kind of the fact that you were discovering all this music that was new to you, you had a different mindset. And I wonder if it's incumbent on us to try to return to that mindset and try to return to that sense of openness. Because something that can happen when you become jaded is that you feel like you know everything that's out there, lots of what's out there, and your standards become so high that it's almost impossible to find something to bring the joy back, something new.
Well, I agree with that to an extent, and maybe jaded is the wrong word, but let me just put it this way. As a youth, and this is the way it is for many kids, and then as a young man, everything there was always an immediacy. For the last 25 years, and this is a very bold statement, popular music has very rarely resonated with me. And that's such a tragedy for me, because I've been in the middle, at the height of my life, of popular music. And basically what happened was, culturally, the world said, well, we've been through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which not only gave us lots of rhythm and groove and feel, but we also gave you lots of harmony and melody. Culturally, the world said, we're going to move into a different territory now based on a hip-hop foundation, a rap foundation, and we no longer value melody and chromaticism and rich harmony the way you do and the way the 60s and 70s and 80s do. And so from here on out, most of the pop literature will not reflect that.
Yeah, I always, as somebody who's kind of shares your perspective, I just try to ask myself if there's anything I should be doing differently, to be receptive to whatever's happening musically, because I don't want to not like anything that's on the radio. And if it's bringing joy to other people, I want to understand, what's going on and what other people are feeling. So I'm trying to investigate and, where does my responsibility start and end as a listener?
Well, that's completely noble and virtuous, and I agree with you 100%. I think your point is dead on. I think the listener does have a certain amount of responsibility. I don't want to make it as black and white. For example, I've enjoyed moments of hip-hop since its inception. I mean, if one wants to say hip-hop's inception, rap's inception is, as a lot of tradition will say, it's Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang in 1977. Obviously, there were beat poets and stuff before that. But that's when the door is opened, and here we go. And there have been moments since then that I have been in awe and have derived some fulfillment from hip-hop moments. I was pretty obsessed with NWA and Beastie Boys and Cool Keith and some other scattered heroes, Beck. And at the end of the day, that's not what I kept coming back to feed my soul. I kept finding that I would still rather go listen to a Bill Evans solo piano moment from the 60s, or a Todd Rundgren solo album from the early 70s, or 10cc's recordings from 1978, or the Smiths album from 1983, on and on and on. I just kept going back to that stuff to get my fix, because contemporary music, even though there were certainly moments that intrigued me and I respected and moved me, were not doing it. The dosage wasn't as high.
Right.
It was the music that kept me alive was uncut. This music was watered down to me. The emotional conveyance was not happening for me.
So what's going on right now? What do you care about the most at this juncture?
What I care about the most is continuing to help artists realize their vision. When I enjoy their vision and relate to it, even better. And then in between the cracks, continuing to give more pleasure to those people who are intrigued by what I do. And the biggest miracle is that we keep getting new fans here and there that weren't even born when the Jellyfish records came out. So it's just, in the same way that parents played their kids' Beatles records and they seemed to enjoy them, even though the kids were only listening to the latest Wu-Tang album. That inspires me to keep giving this gift back to an audience. I've always said, people say, well, why don't you produce? I have done some production, but very, very little, other than my own stuff, of course, bands I've been involved with. And it was basically because a band never came across my radar, or I was never introduced to somebody that I went, you know what? I can really sink my teeth into this and help these folks. Because I always feared I was going to take away, that I was going to want to change their vision to be my vision too much. And that's not what a good producer does. They facilitate, they don't, as Jack Joseph used to call them, reducers. They're not producers, they're reducers. I didn't want to be a reducer. It's a colossal responsibility. So, and there's no, there was no band called the Runaways that ever came my way that I could be the Kim Fowley to. So that never happened, and that's all right. It's been a very weird trajectory, because I just saw an interview on a Zoom conference. It was miraculous, with Elvis Costello. And the person who interviewed him was an amazing producer who's primarily done work in the Latin community, named Sebastian Crease, who produced Elvis Costello and the Attractions' last album. And he interviewed Elvis. This was a week and a half ago. And I don't even know how old Elvis is now. He's recovered from cancer. He's one of the most prolific human beings on the planet. And for the most part, I've been a fan of his entire body work, give or take certain periods. He's one of my heroes. When I was sitting there listening to him, I almost went into tears because he was describing to me what the ideal is for a singer-songwriter, for this kind of classic genre that he's operated in over the years. And it's what I was trained in. It's what I feel I excel at, that I make my own comments on. I have my own stake in it. And I was like, oh my God, he not only does he get it, but what a rare bird. He's like some unearthed mummy that's just, he's been in a cave for 50 million years, and the scientists have just melted him down and thawed him out. And I was just like, how come this is a rare commodity? And it's because it's generational. Now, I'm in awe that there aren't more Elvis Costellos running the planet, while there still are these buckets and tons of hip hop, rap. Well, it's all hip hop, hip hop, and programming, computer influenced pop. That's fine, but there's very few people running around saying, "Oh, fucking Beatles, man, huge influence." Really? That's funny. When I go and listen to your album, I don't hear any of it, and it's not speaking to me. And I'm not saying you have to mimic the Beatles and be a retro act for me to like what you do. I'm just saying I don't hear any of the sensibilities and emotional conveyance that pop rock band happened to have huge success with. I'm still in awe that the Beatles touched as many people as they did, because there are, good God, 50 or 60 other bands from that era into the 60s and 70s that were just as good and wrote amazing material. And I know there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's simply no longer valued to that degree, and that's just the way it is. And I can be bitter about it, or like you said, I can be responsible and figure out, well, what's my role in participating and continuing to keep it fresh and exciting for people, which is what I wake up every morning and try to do.
Well, that's a great place to end it. Roger Manning, thanks so much for being on the show.
What can I say? Thank you for letting me go off. I know, I want a little disclaimer for yourself and the audience. I want to make sure that people understand that I'm very aware that in my passion and my conviction that I might have a tendency to come across as arrogant and better than, or just condescending, and that's nothing could be further from the truth. That's not how I carry myself. But I'm very well aware of my tendency to maybe come across that way in how I express myself. So I'm just putting that out there.
Okay. I appreciate that. I was thinking the whole time what an asshole you are. The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.